but realistically we see oysters as more than just oysters. They actually create ecosystems. They're ecosystem engineers. And so part of what we want to do is to look at the ecosystem services that they provide by the structure and stuff. And part of what motivates this is both, and she listed all the policy, I'm just going to list a few high points here, but both in Maryland's Oyster Restoration Plan and NOAA's Habitat Blueprint, there is this call to look at restoration, not just for its not just for restoring the thing you're trying to restore, but also the broader ecological and economic context. So that's why we moved to ecosystem services. Okay, you probably hear the word ecosystem services a lot, and I think it gets confused and confounded a bit. So we're actually talking about in terms of sort of the seminal paper by Boyd and Bonzoff, where ultimately the ecosystem service is something that you can then translate into a dollar or socioeconomic value. So we won't get into all that because we don't have enough time, but there's lots of things that are ecologically important, part of an ecological production function that produce an ecological service at the end. So just so there's a lot more clarity there, you got a definition we can talk about later. So some of the ecosystem services you would see with an oyster reef. So you got an oyster reef. Well, of course, they do produce oyster meat that gets sold in various forms. And to some extent, when you remove that oyster, you're removing some nitrogen and carbon. They sequester carbon, I suppose. I haven't really measured that. But there's also the fact that these act as habitat for a lot of fish, or at least some refuge from prey. So there's the potential that they're also helping to produce other fish, and I use that term very loosely, fish, shellfish, blue crabs, that sort of thing. You like my icons there, Bill? The denitrification, in fact, right now as we speak, there's a group of folks at ORP, Oyster Restoration Partnership, meeting to talk about the possibility of using oysters as a best management practice. I think there's a lot more science that needs to be done there, but it's good. And then maybe down in Virginia, and definitely like in the Gulf Coast, oysters, they've done some look at the shoreline protection they offer. This is for intertidal oysters. They get a little too cool up here in the wintertime to have much intertidal oyster, but a little further south. So that you actually, instead of having to put in riprap and bulkhead, oysters will do some. So there's been a lot of work done. I'm not going to read all of these, but there's been a lot of work done sort of here and there looking at some services the oysters provide. And this will be available online if you want to look up one of these references. But we really want to use this as a framework to start pulling together some of this information. So that's where we're going with this. And we talked about this chop tank complex. We're focusing on doing some studies in this area, either stuff we funded or stuff that the Chesapeake Bay office is doing in sort of these three main tributaries. We're calling the chop tank complex. Sounds like some sort of psychiatric disease. We've got a chop tank complex. So here's back to that idea of oyster or ecosystem services. So really what we want to do is develop an ecological production function. So we do some studies, quantify some relationships to develop an ecological production function, essentially, that would be used to estimate an ecosystem service. In this case, is a finfish biomass, and then ultimately we're working with some economists at NOAA to then what's the added value of the marginal increase of the oyster or the finfish that would come about as we restore the oysters. What's the value to that commercially and recreationally? So that's the overall view. I'm going to break this down. This is the key components of what the Chesapeake Bay office is doing, and I'll have a short list of some stuff we funded externally. So some of the ecological studies we do are to look at habitat complexity. So Stephanie mentioned this, the bottom mapping work we do. We even do some really fine scale stuff, so you can look at the rugosity, the bumpiness or roughness of an oyster reef, and the heights of the reefs and that sort of thing, to think about, that's three-dimensional structure of habitat, and is that three-dimensional structure of habitat important for not only the finfish, but also in just increasing oyster abundance itself. So we've got some detailed studies there that we're working on, and I should say this is sort of a before and after control intervention sort of study. So that we've done 1 year of before in the Tret Avon. This year we're going to be doing the Tret Avon in the little chop tank to do the before restoration, and then 3 years from now when it's all restored, we'll go back. We'll probably do it several years in a row because we want to kind of see the ecological succession associated with this. So this is, so we want to understand the sort of three-dimensional habitat, but also the water column habitat. People think of this as water quality. We think of it as water column habitat for these fish. So you might have an area of reef, for example, that was great habitat for some reef-associated fish, but if the water column habitat is not right, they're not going to be able to get there. So we're monitoring that. We've done some in-situ monitoring, and we're working with Bruce Michael's group and Mark Trice to put out some continuous observing equipment to measure temperature, salinity, those sorts of things.
We've had those out there since March 27th, I believe.
Right. Yeah, they've been doing stuff in Harris Creek, and we're going to do some stuff in the Tread Avon, and so they're going to help us with all the data and stuff. That's a lot of data. So and then so you have this habitat. Now we actually want to go out and sample the fish that are out there. So we got a whole big pot design. I think I've got a sample of the tripe there. This is just a black sea bass in an oyster reef ball. So there are fish that like reefs. That's good to know, right? And we take all that and we put it into this oyster reef ecosystem model. This is one I built with a grad student from Johns Hopkins, just based on a typical Chesapeake Bay reef, just through the literature review. So if you can get estimates of these biomasses, then some of these other more transient species that are commercially and recreationally important, like striped bass, summer flounder, if you know stuff about these lower trophic levels and the trophic transfer efficiency, you can estimate, if you increase oyster reef, which causes increases in these things, how will that then increase these commercially and recreationally important fish species? So that, we actually submitted that, got to do some revisions on that initial model, and then we're going to refine that model with an actual chop tank complex model. And then that will go into some economic analysis that we're going to be starting to work. Well, we've got funding for, but it probably will be several months before we get rolling, getting postdocs and that sort of stuff, so that we can, go out and do estimates of the commercial and recreational value of those fish, and then simulate in the model, if we increase the oyster reefs, increase the fish, what's the marginal increase in these other benefits. So that's what our office is doing within NOAA. We've also funded some external partners. Ron Lipschitz and Rochelle Sykes are doing some similar work down in Virginia. They have the benefit of not just having to use fish traps, they can also video, because the water's clear enough there to help identify fish. Ken Payer, Lisa Kellogg, and Paige Ross are going to be looking at, again, macrofauna, but they're actually looking at the benthic macrofauna, and then Mark and Lisa and Paige are also looking at fish, so they're looking at two different components, and then working with Jeff Cornwell to look at actual nitrogen removal. That's a lot more costly and a lot harder to get that done, but that's the next thing. We're actually, Mark and several others have worked with STAC and with our office to put together some estimates. We want to keep plugging away on that and advise that. And I keep forgetting the name of your group. I put that right there, Bruce, but Bruce's group is doing some water column habitat, Tread Avon, Harris Creek, and then our double colleague doing some economic stuff. So it's going to be a long-term sort of thing. We're getting some initial results, and we'll certainly publish things, just simple things like looking at correlations between habitat complexity and how many oysters are there will be very helpful for informing restoration. So we'll be able to know, is it okay to just spread a bunch of shell loosely on the ground, or do we need to kind of pile it up, a foot or two, or that sort of thing, which is going to give us the most benefits. So there'll be several products along the way as we go, but this is sort of our new way of thinking of this. And I got a whole bunch of results that I'm not going to go through, but that's what our trap design looks like. We're running these traps in all our control and our restoration sites. Some results, but we don't have time. We'll talk about that later.